September 29, 1957. A quiet evening in the Ural Mountains, the kind where the wind moves slowly through the trees and the light fades without sound. But at 4:20 p.m., that calm was shattered by an explosion so violent it cracked open the earth itself. A blast ripped through the ground beneath a facility that officially didn't exist. A closed Soviet city known only by a postal code. Chelyabinsk, 40. A massive underground storage tank filled with radioactive waste had just detonated. In an instant, a slab of concrete weighing over 150 tons was hurled hundreds of meters into the air, landing like a meteor back on Soviet soil. The ground convulsed. Buildings miles away shook as windows shattered and alarms wailed in confusion. The explosion released 20 million curies of radiation, an invisible poison that would drift silently across the landscape, contaminating rivers, forests, and villages for decades to come. The force of the blast was equivalent to 70 thou at 100 tons of TNT, strong enough to register on seismic instruments across Europe. But for all its fury, the world heard nothing. No headlines, no emergency broadcasts. Not even a whisper, because this was the Soviet Union, and in 1957, disasters didn't exist unless the government said they did. At the epicenter stood the Mayak nuclear complex, one of the most secret facilities in the world. Officially, it was a chemical plant. In truth, it was a plutonium factory, producing the core material for the Soviet Union's atomic weapons. Built in the fever of the Cold War, Mayak was constructed with one goal in mind: outpace the Americans, no matter the cost. Safety was a luxury the Soviet state couldn't afford, and its absence would soon rewrite history. The facility's reactors had been leaking radioactive waste for years. Lakes, rivers, and soil were already poisoned long before the explosion. But secrecy made contamination a non-event. The workers inside the complex were sworn to silence. The residents of the nearby towns had no idea they were living beside a ticking bomb, and the rest of the world didn't even know this place existed. When the tank blew, the Soviets didn't call it an accident. They called it classified. Within minutes, the military sealed off the area. Roads were blocked, phone lines were cut, planes were grounded. For hundreds of miles in every direction, people looked up to see a strange, glowing cloud drifting across the horizon. A toxic aurora that no one would ever be allowed to explain. Witnesses would later recall the eerie beauty of that moment, a shimmering orange hue spreading through the evening sky like a second sunset. But this wasn't light. It was radiation. Cesium, strontium, cerium, elements that would burrow into the soil, into the crops, into the bones of anyone who lived beneath that silent storm. For 7 long days, no one said a word. No warnings were given, no evacuations ordered. Life continued as normal in the path of an invisible death. Children played outside as radioactive dust settled on their hair. Farmers brought in harvests that glowed with unseen energy. Mothers poured milk that would soon turn to poison. And as the fallout stretched over 20,000 square kilometers, one truth became clear. The disaster at Kyshtym wasn't just an explosion. It was an erasure, an event so devastating and so shrouded in secrecy that it would take 3 decades for the world to learn it had ever happened. This was not Chernobyl. This was not 3 Mile Island. This was something far worse, a disaster that was never supposed to exist. To understand how the Kyshtym disaster could ever happen, you have to go back to the years after World War II, when the Soviet Union was still bleeding, yet burning with ambition. The war had proven one thing: power no longer came from armies or borders. It came from the atom. And after the United States unleashed nuclear fire on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin wanted that same power, whatever the cost. In 1945, a secret order was given to build a facility deep in the Ural Mountains, far from foreign eyes. The location was chosen for its isolation, shielded by forests and lakes. No maps marked it. No roads led directly to it. The workers who built it weren't told what they were constructing. Many never left alive. By 1948, the facility was operational. It was named Mayak, lighthouse in Russian, though there was nothing guiding or bright about it. On paper, it was an industrial complex. In reality, it was the beating heart of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. Its sole mission to produce weapons-grade plutonium as fast as possible. The city that grew around it was called Chelyabinsk 40, later renamed Ozersk, but officially it didn't exist. It was a closed city, erased from maps, hidden behind barbed wire and armed checkpoints. Even its residents lived under an illusion. To outsiders, they were postal code numbers, not citizens. Mail was censored, travel was forbidden, and speaking the city's name aloud could mean imprisonment. Life inside Chelyabinsk 40 was a paradox. It was both a reward and a prison. Scientists, engineers, and their families lived in comfortable apartments, had access to better rations, and were told they were heroes, the chosen few building the future of the motherland. Yet they couldn't leave, couldn't write, couldn't tell the world what they were doing. The same fences that kept secrets from escaping also kept the people trapped inside. From the beginning, Mayak operated under an impossible equation: speed over safety. Stalin demanded results, and delay was seen as disloyalty. Between 1949 and 1952, the plant dumped billions of gallons of radioactive wastewater directly into the Teka River, the lifeline for more than 20 villages downstream. Families used that water to cook, wash, and drink. They watched their crops fail and their children fall ill, never told why. People's teeth began to crumble. Skin lesions appeared. Cattle gave birth to malformed calves. The water they believed sustained them was quietly killing them. But inside the walls of Mayak, the work continued. The scientists knew the danger, but they also knew the consequences of slowing down. Reports warning of contamination were suppressed. Engineers proposing safer methods were reassigned or silenced. In the Soviet Union, progress was measured in megatons, not morality. When the Teka became too contaminated to use, the waste was diverted into Lake Karachay, a small, shallow basin nearby. Within a few years, the lake became so radioactive that standing on its shore for just an hour could deliver a lethal dose of radiation. Even birds that landed on the surface sometimes died mid-flight. Still, production increased. Still, the reactors roared day and night. By 1953, the Soviets decided that dumping waste into open water was no longer sustainable, not for safety reasons, but for efficiency. They began burying liquid radioactive waste in underground steel and concrete storage tanks. These were supposed to be safe, isolated, and temperature-controlled. But as with everything in Chelyabinsk 40, shortcuts were taken. The cooling systems were unreliable, maintenance logs falsified, and radiation sensors frequently malfunctioned. Some tanks were already corroding within a few years of installation. The city lived in the shadow of invisible danger. Residents noticed the metallic taste in the air, the strange sickness that lingered after every rainfall, the way snow seemed to melt in unnatural patterns. But asking questions wasn't allowed. Every man, woman, and child in Chelyabinsk 40 was both a participant and a prisoner in one of the most secret experiments in human history. An experiment that would soon reach its breaking point. Because by 1956, one of those underground tanks, Tank 14, was beginning to fail. And no one in the Soviet Union wanted to be the person who told Moscow that their most precious facility was about to explode. By the mid-1950s, the Mayak complex had become a monument to Soviet ambition and Soviet neglect. The plant had achieved what Stalin wanted. It was producing enough plutonium to fuel an expanding nuclear arsenal. But it was doing so on borrowed time. Every safety compromise, every ignored inspection, every silenced warning was stacking toward the inevitable. At the heart of it all sat Tank 14, a reinforced concrete and steel cylinder buried beneath the ground, holding more than 80 tons of highly radioactive waste. Inside, that waste wasn't static. It was alive, constantly decaying, constantly generating heat. To prevent it from boiling, engineers had installed a cooling system that circulated water around the tank 24 hours a day. As long as the system worked, the tank remained stable. But in the Soviet Union of 1956, stable was a fragile word. The first signs of trouble were small. Gauges began showing irregular temperature spikes. Control panels flickered. Maintenance crews submitted reports about corrosion in the cooling pipes, but repairs were postponed, always postponed. There were quotas to meet, deadlines to hit, generals to impress. The Cold War didn't wait for maintenance. By late 1956, the cooling system had partially failed. Instead of shutting it down, the engineers jury-rigged temporary fixes, hoses patched with scrap metal, valves sealed with makeshift welds. They logged it as operational. In the Soviet playbook, appearance mattered more than accuracy. Inside the tank, unseen chemistry was unfolding. Without proper cooling, the liquid waste began to evaporate, leaving behind a thick, concentrated sludge of radioactive nitrates and acetates. These compounds crystallized as the water disappeared, forming an unstable mixture that grew hotter with each passing week. The tank's own radioactive decay was cooking it from the inside out. In early 1957, one technician described the readings as beyond acceptable parameters. Another warned that Tank 14 had become, in his words, a bomb waiting for permission to explode. But permission never came. The Soviet nuclear program was under relentless pressure to deliver. Production targets came directly from Moscow, and falling short was treated as sabotage. The unspoken rule was clear. Don't report problems, fix them quietly, or bury them deeper. So the staff did what they always did. They stayed quiet. The temperature continued to rise. The cooling pipes finally failed completely. The tank was left to stew in its own radioactive heat. By September 1957, the waste inside had dried into a volatile crystalline mass. Each crystal was infused with enough energy to power a small city or destroy one. The chemical instability reached a breaking point, and all it needed was a spark. At 4:20 p.m., September 29, 1957, the spark arrived. Some reports suggest a mechanical jolt. Others, a final chemical reaction triggered by heat buildup. Whatever it was, it set off a chain reaction inside the tank. The explosion was instantaneous. A deafening roar tore through the facility. The earth trembled as the concrete lid, weighing nearly 150 tons, was launched skyward, landing hundreds of meters away. The shock wave flattened walls, shattered windows, and sent a plume of radioactive debris thousands of feet into the atmosphere. It wasn't a nuclear detonation, but what followed was worse. Instead of a clean blast, the explosion vaporized a toxic mixture of strontium-90, cesium-137, and cerium-144, releasing them into the air in microscopic particles. They rose like dust, invisible and deadly, riding the wind northeast across the Urals. Within minutes, a dark cloud formed above the facility, glowing faintly in the evening light. Workers stared in silence, not realizing that the shimmer they saw was radiation scattering the sunset. The Mayak complex had become ground zero for one of the most severe radioactive releases in human history. And yet, inside the control room, the first order was not evacuate, it was seal the records. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't a disaster, it was a secret. When the explosion tore through the Mayak facility, the danger didn't end with the blast. It began with the wind. The detonation sent an enormous radioactive cloud rising thousands of meters into the air. The particles, microscopic, weightless, and deadly, caught the prevailing winds and drifted northeast, crossing over forests, farmlands, and villages that had never even heard of the word Mayak. For the next 10 hours, a storm of invisible poison swept across the Urals. About 800 tons of radioactive material began to settle on the earth below, ash that glowed only in death. There was no fire, no smoke, no sound, just a fine dust settling quietly over everything, the soil, the crops, the water, the people. At first, no one noticed. Farmers looked up and saw what seemed like a strange orange shimmer in the evening sky. Children pointed at it, mistaking it for the northern lights. But that glow wasn't the aurora. It was cesium and strontium scattering light as it drifted downward. By dawn, the field sparkled faintly with dew that wasn't dew at all. In the hours that followed, the East Ural radioactive trace was born, a 300-kilometer scar stretching northeast from the explosion site. At its widest point, it spanned nearly 50 kilometers, blanketing an area larger than the state of Massachusetts. 270,000 people lived beneath that radioactive plume. Most of them had no idea they were already contaminated. The fallout was uneven, carried by wind currents and rain. One village might be drenched in lethal isotopes while the next remained nearly untouched. But those who stood directly in the cloud's path were doomed from the start. Animals began dying first. Birds fell from the sky. Cows collapsed in the fields, their hair falling out in clumps. Rivers turned deadly, clear to the eye, toxic to the touch. Wells that had sustained families for generations became undrinkable overnight. Then the people began to change. The first symptoms were subtle: fatigue, nausea, headaches. Villagers blamed it on the harvest season, on bad food, on the weather. But soon came the burns. Skin reddened and peeled from faces exposed to the air. Children's hair came out in handfuls. Open sores appeared that refused to heal. Still, there were no warnings. The government had sealed off the entire region, but told no one why. Soldiers were posted along roads to block passage, not to help the sick. They checked papers, not radiation levels. The local doctors were ordered to keep quiet. Anyone who asked questions was told the cause was food poisoning, influenza, or unknown agricultural contamination. In the villages nearest to Mayak, radiation levels reached as high as 400 roentgens per hour, a dose strong enough to kill in days. Yet life continued. Parents sent their children to school. Farmers milked their cows, their hands burning from the invisible heat. That milk was later sold and distributed to nearby towns. The contamination spread like a ghost, carried not just by wind, but by trade, by touch, by the unknowing rhythm of everyday life. A week passed before the first evacuations began. But even then, the people weren't told the truth. Officials arrived in trucks and informed villagers they were being temporarily relocated for agricultural development. Families were given a few hours to gather what they could carry. Their pets were left behind. Their livestock was shot and buried in shallow pits that glowed faintly at night. 22 villages were erased completely, bulldozed and removed from Soviet maps. Their names, their cemeteries, their histories, gone. The soil they once stood on was scraped away and buried elsewhere, as if memory itself could be contained. But the radiation didn't care about borders or lies. It seeped deeper into the ground, into the rivers, into the food chain. For the next 50 years, it would move quietly through the ecosystem, into fish, into grain, into the bones of those who stayed. The Soviet state may have buried its villages, but it couldn't bury the fallout. Because this was no longer a local disaster. It was a permanent stain on the land itself, a radioactive rain that would never truly stop falling. In the Soviet Union, truth was never destroyed. It was simply classified. Within hours of the explosion, Moscow knew. Radiation detectors across the Ural region had gone off the charts. But the first order from the Kremlin wasn't evacuate. It was silence everything. Soldiers were dispatched from Sverdlovsk and Moscow, not with medical supplies, but with rifles and roadblocks. Trucks rolled in, carrying Geiger counters and men in lead-lined suits. Checkpoints were erected on every road leading to the Mayak complex. Phone lines were severed, telegram offices shuttered, and any pilot flying over the region was ordered to change course. For the people living beneath the radioactive cloud, the sudden presence of troops was terrifying, but not nearly as terrifying as the silence that followed. No announcements, no warnings, just uniformed men who told them nothing. Behind the barricades, the state began rewriting reality. The official name of the region was removed from internal maps. Reports about abnormal livestock deaths were confiscated from local veterinarians. Medical documents describing unexplained burns were stamped top secret. Even the meteorological logs that recorded the strange orange cloud were recalled and destroyed. To outsiders, the disaster vanished overnight. Foreign embassies that detected unusual radiation levels across Europe were told it was the result of atmospheric nuclear tests. When a Swedish scientist asked about the sudden spike in radioactive isotopes in the air, Soviet diplomats laughed it off as Western hysteria. The lie was simple, efficient, and complete. Inside the exclusion zone, the machinery of censorship worked with surgical precision. The KGB took control of the area's hospitals. Doctors were instructed never to use the term radiation sickness. If a patient's skin peeled away or their blood cell counts collapsed, the diagnosis was rewritten as dermatitis, anemia, or unknown fever. Those who refused to alter records were transferred to remote posts or quietly disappeared. Teachers were ordered to tell students that the empty villages nearby were being reorganized. Census takers were told to skip those districts entirely. Families of missing relatives received government letters stating that their loved ones had relocated for labor purposes. In a single week, entire communities were erased not just from the land, but from history. Even nature was enlisted in the deception. In 1968, the Soviets transformed the most contaminated stretch of the East Ural Trace into what they called a state nature reserve. To the outside world, it sounded like an environmental success story, a sanctuary for wildlife. In truth, it was a radioactive wasteland sealed behind barbed wire, a convenient reason to keep civilians and journalists out forever. Every agency had its role. The military contained the perimeter. The scientists falsified the data. And the propagandists flooded local newspapers with distractions, stories about harvest triumphs and space achievements, anything to drown out the whispers of illness. But whispers have a way of escaping. Even in a state built on silence, rumors spread. Villagers spoke of animals that glowed at night, of soldiers burying entire barns, of doctors who came in black cars and never returned. Still, they were afraid to speak too loudly. Everyone knew what happened to people who asked too many questions. For nearly 2 years, the deception held. The Western world remained blind, and the people most affected continued to live, work, and die in contaminated soil, believing that their suffering was just bad luck. The Soviet Union had achieved the impossible. They had not only detonated a nuclear bomb in their own backyard, they had convinced an entire nation it never happened. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Soon the sickness that spread through the villages would grow too large to hide. And when the truth finally began to leak, it wouldn't come from Moscow. It would come from the people the state tried hardest to silence. In the months that followed the explosion, the silence grew heavier than the radiation itself. By the time the first doctors were allowed into the region, it was already too late for many. The air, the soil, the rivers, everything had become contaminated. But the people didn't know that. They were told to keep farming, to keep living, to keep trusting. At first it was just exhaustion. Villagers complained of dizziness, headaches, and strange metallic tastes in their mouths. Then came the nausea, skin lesions, bleeding gums, hair loss. Children stopped playing outside. They were too tired to run. Animals died where they stood. Crops withered before harvest. The water, once clear and cold, now smelled faintly of metal. But no one dared question it, because in the Soviet Union, questions were dangerous. When medical teams finally arrived, they wore protective suits. The villagers didn't. People watched as soldiers marked their homes with chalk and ordered them to leave immediately. They were told it was for agricultural improvement. Nothing more. Families had hours to pack. They took what they could carry. A few blankets, family photographs, a bit of bread. The rest they left behind, their livestock, their furniture, their entire lives. Some even left their elderly parents, who were too weak to travel. The trucks rolled out without explanation. No one told them where they were going, or if they'd ever return. When they asked, soldiers repeated the same line, "It's temporary." But for most, it wasn't. Over the following months, 22 villages were erased from the map. Roughly 10,000 people were relocated, though hundreds of thousands remained in contaminated areas. The government drew invisible lines. Those within the danger zone would be evacuated. Those outside would simply be monitored. It was easier to study radiation exposure than to move an entire population. The people who stayed became living experiments. Doctors came not to treat them, but to observe. They took blood samples, measured decay rates, noted lesions and birth defects. Some villagers thought the tests meant help was coming. It wasn't. The scientists were there to learn, not to heal. The effects appeared generation by generation. Children born after the explosion suffered the most. Some were blind at birth. Others were born without limbs, or with deformities doctors refused to record. Mothers were told their babies had failed to thrive. The bodies were taken away and never returned. Those who survived carried the radiation inside them, in their bones, their teeth, their blood. Strontium-90, an isotope that mimics calcium, became part of them. It settled deep in their skeletons, quietly irradiating them from within. It couldn't be washed away or healed. It simply waited. By the 1960s, the villages that hadn't been evacuated became ghost towns in slow motion. People died young, 30, 40, sometimes less. Graves filled with names that shared the same year of death. The Soviet government attributed the spike in mortality to natural causes. Even decades later, survivors would recall the eerie quiet. No sirens, no warnings, just the slow unraveling of their world. A farmer's wife named Nadia Kapova once said, "We didn't even know we were sick. We just knew everyone around us was dying." Families clung to the myth that the government would protect them until the truth leaked through the cracks, through whispered conversations, secret letters, and the sheer, undeniable pattern of death. But the human cost wasn't just in bodies. It was in trust. In the quiet realization that their own government had poisoned them and lied about it. The survivors were left to rebuild their lives on poisoned soil, raising sick children in homes built on radioactive dust. They were told to work, to smile, to keep quiet. Because acknowledging the truth meant admitting that the motherland itself had turned against them. For the Soviet Union, the people of the Urals were expendable. For the survivors, every breath was a reminder that silence can kill more efficiently than any bomb. For nearly 20 years, the Kyshtym disaster existed only as a rumor, a shadow whispered among scientists and soldiers who dared not put anything in writing. But truth, like radiation, has a way of seeping through cracks. By 1958, foreign monitoring stations in Scandinavia and Western Europe began detecting strange isotopes drifting through the atmosphere. Cesium, strontium, ruthenium, the chemical fingerprints of a major nuclear accident. But when Western journalists questioned Moscow, the Soviets dismissed it as nonsense, blaming atmospheric weapons tests. Behind the Iron Curtain, denial was policy. The first real hints came not from foreign spies, but from Soviet refugees. Some had fled from the Ural region, carrying stories of burned villages and a sickness that kills from the inside. Their testimonies were fragmentary, hard to verify, and easily dismissed as Cold War propaganda. For the West, Kyshtym was a ghost story, haunting but unproven. Then in 1976, the silence finally cracked. A Soviet biologist named Dr. Zhoris Medvedev had fled to the United Kingdom years earlier. While combing through obscure Soviet scientific papers, he noticed something strange. Repeated references to radioactively contaminated territories in the Urals, areas supposedly used for long-term radiation research. But there were no known accidents in that region, unless one had been erased. Medvedev began piecing it together. He interviewed scientists who had quietly studied the East Ural radioactive trace. He compared maps, dates, and isotope half-lives. And slowly, the truth emerged. There had been a catastrophic explosion in 1957, far worse than anything the world had been told. That year, Medvedev published his findings in The New Scientist under the title Nuclear Disaster in the Urals. The article landed like a seismic shock. For the first time, the world had a name, Kyshtym, and a rough outline of what had happened. Western analysts initially doubted the scale, calling it improbable. Even the CIA had information confirming Medvedev's account, but chose to keep it classified to protect intelligence sources. For them, the truth was less valuable than maintaining the balance of secrecy. Still, the story spread. More scientists began digging. Nuclear experts compared the isotopic data Medvedev cited to fallout records from the 1950s. The match was undeniable. The Soviet government, furious and cornered, called Medvedev a liar, a traitor, and a tool of Western disinformation. They denied the existence of any explosion. They denied the Mayak facility even existed. But the walls were closing in. When the Soviet Union finally began to unravel in the late 1980s, the dam of silence broke. In 1989, under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness, Moscow at last admitted the unthinkable. Yes, there had been a nuclear accident in 1957. Yes, it had released massive amounts of radiation, and yes, the state had hidden it for more than 3 decades. But even then, the truth came slowly, filtered through layers of deflection and denial. Officials claimed the explosion released only a fraction of Chernobyl's radiation, a technical half-truth that ignored how concentrated and deadly the isotopes were. For the survivors, that acknowledgement meant little. Many were already dead. Those who remained had lived decades in secrecy, their bodies decaying while their government denied their pain. In the years that followed, a new generation of voices rose from the ashes. Among them, a man named Guzman Kabirov, born just months after the explosion. He grew up along the Techa River, surrounded by unexplained deaths and sick neighbors. As an adult, he made it his life's mission to prove what the government refused to admit, that his people had been poisoned by design. Kabirov walked the irradiated villages with a Geiger counter, documenting radiation levels higher than Chernobyl's exclusion zone. He founded a watchdog group, gathered testimonies, and petitioned endlessly for justice. The government labeled him an enemy of the state. But he didn't stop. After years of pressure, Moscow finally offered limited compensation, around 1 million rubles, or roughly $30,000, to each surviving family, or the option of relocation. Yet the new homes were often built just a few kilometers from the contaminated zone. The government had learned nothing. By then, the world's attention had shifted to newer disasters. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima. Kyshtym faded once again into quiet obscurity. But those who lived through it never forgot. In interviews decades later, survivors said they still couldn't bring themselves to speak the city's real name. It had been erased for so long, they feared saying it aloud might erase them too. The truth had finally escaped, but like the radiation that caused it, the damage had already spread too far to contain. More than 6 decades later, the radioactive scars of Kyshtym still run beneath the Ural soil. The forests have regrown, the rivers look clean again, and life has returned in cautious forms. But the land remembers. Beneath the moss and pine needles lie isotopes with half-lives longer than the memories of the people who once lived there. The area once called the East Ural Radioactive Trace is now designated as the East Ural Nature Reserve, a closed zone still off-limits to civilians. Officially, it exists to study the recovery of ecosystems after contamination. Unofficially, it's a graveyard, a reminder disguised as a research project. In nearby Ozersk, once known as Chelyabinsk 40, the Mayak facility still operates. It no longer builds atomic bombs, but it still handles nuclear waste, processing and storing it in the same soil that cracked open in 1957. Modern safety standards are far higher now, yet even today, Mayak remains one of the most contaminated places on Earth. For the people who lived and died under its shadow, compensation came too late. And for many, not at all. Thousands succumbed to cancers, blood disorders, and genetic mutations that would ripple through generations. Children grew up in orphanages built for those born unfit. Entire family lines ended quietly, erased not by time, but by secrecy. And still, the Soviet government never fully admitted the scope of the tragedy. When asked how such an event could be hidden for so long, one survivor said simply, "Because we were told not to exist." It's easy to think of Kyshtym as a historical footnote, a relic from a time when nations tested their strength with uranium and lies. But the lessons it left behind are not relics. They are warnings. The first lesson is simple. Safety cannot exist in silence. The cooling system that failed could have been repaired. The explosion could have been prevented. But in a system where fear outweighs truth, every engineer, every doctor, every citizen learned to stay quiet. And silence is what kills. The second lesson, secrecy multiplies suffering. The Soviet Union believed that by hiding the disaster, it could erase it. But radiation does not respect propaganda. It moves through air, through water, through generations. It outlasts regimes. The third, the pursuit of power, always carries a cost. Mayak gave the Soviet Union its bomb. It gave the world another superpower. But it also poisoned a land the size of a small country, and the people who built it never lived to see the victory they died for. And the final lesson, truth, like radiation, cannot be contained forever. For 30 years, the KGB, the military, and the Ministry of Health buried every trace of Kyshtym. They erased villages, altered maps, and silenced witnesses. But still, the truth escaped through a defector's article, a villager's memory, a scientist's conscience. It may have taken decades, but eventually the story emerged. And in that story lies the one thing the Soviet Union could never bury: proof that even the most powerful governments cannot suppress the laws of nature or the human need to know. Today, standing in the forests around Mayak, you would never guess what happened here. The trees sway, the rivers glitter in the sun, and birds sing over soil that still hums faintly with radiation. It looks alive, but it isn't healed. The ground breathes with the memory of that day, the day the Soviet Union detonated its own secret and tried to bury it beneath silence. The Kyshtym disaster is often called the third worst nuclear accident in human history. But in truth, it was more than an accident. It was a revelation, a moment when human ambition met the consequences of secrecy, and lost. Because radiation may fade, governments may fall, but silence leaves a longer shadow.